Good evening, everybody. My name is Rich Clybourne. I'm the Executive Director of the Gundalow Company, and I want to welcome you to the final virtual Gundalow gathering of 2021. Before we get started, I have a couple of announcements to make. The first one is that the Gundalow Company is currently in the last couple of weeks of its annual appeal, and presently we have a $20,000 challenge match up. One of our donors has put up $20,000 and has challenged folks to match that total, not individually, but as a group. So the month of December, every donation up to that $20,000 essentially will get doubled. So I encourage you, if you haven't made your annual gift to the Gundalow Company yet, that please do so to take advantage of that $20,000 challenge match. If you've already given, we thank you very much. Every donation, every dollar that we collect goes to our education programs, as I'm sure you're aware. Those programs are award-winning and very vital to the development of the next generation of river and bay stewards in this area. Second announcement I have is that we are also currently doing a half-price gift card campaign. So if you go online and purchase a gift card, you essentially are getting 2 for 1. So if you purchase a $36 gift card, that will be good for $72. So you can take advantage of that and have 2 tickets for a sale in 2022. So please, I encourage you to go out to the website and check that. So that's all the announcements I have. What I'd like to do now is turn this over to our moderator for the evening, who is Jess Orenberger. And just so you know, 2 things. First of all, our current program manager, Val Moyer, is going to be leaving us as of Friday. She has a doctoral dissertation that she has to finish up and defend. So we wish her all the best and the best of luck with getting that dissertation done and the defense completed. So on January 1st, Jess Orenberger will take over as the program manager of the Gundalow Company. So Jess, please take it away.
All right, cool. Thank you for that intro, Rich. Welcome everybody to our Science Cafe. Tonight we will be talking about beavers and dams. So I wanted to thank you all for coming out, and I also wanted to thank our speakers for being here. Tonight we will be talking with Patrick Tate, who is a certified wildlife biologist through the Wildlife Society and holds a Master of Science degree in wildlife. And he is employed with the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department as a wildlife biologist. And we'll also be speaking with Dr. Wilfred Woolham, who is an associate professor at UNH in the Natural Resources Department and co-director of the Water Systems Analysis Group, which explores the processes that shape hydrological systems. So a couple of great experts to talk about beavers and dams with us. So the way that this is going to work, we will let our speakers talk for 5 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to questions. If you have a question when that's time, you can feel free to pop it into the chat and we can get it that way. Or if you raise your hand on your screen, we'll be scrolling around to call on people that way as well. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Patrick Tate. Patrick, you can feel free to share your screen. I believe we made you a co-host, so you should have that ability.
Okay. Thank you, Jess. I didn't create any PowerPoints and whatnot.
Oh, then no worries.
I don't have anything to share. But what I want to do is give some history about New Hampshire Fish and Game Department and beavers. So as far as the history of Fish and Game Department goes and all wildlife, that could go on for days. But for the purpose of today, sticking with beavers. The New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, approximately in 1865, the department was established. It was established as a law enforcement group to enforce the laws at that time. Now, for the 16 and 1700s, wildlife harvest went unregulated, unrestricted in any way. People did what they needed to do to survive. So if we start when European settlization occurred in the 1600s within New Hampshire, beaver flowages were an important resource to those settling what is now the state of New Hampshire, or the area of what is the state of New Hampshire. The settlers would remove beaver, use the beaver themselves for food, and then they would graze the beaver impoundments for their livestock. The first few years, those impoundments would grow really good, nutritious food, and then, but after a few years, they didn't grow as well, and they'd move on as far as grazing goes. So we all hear about the fur trade, and the fur trade gets a lot of blame for the loss of fur-bearing species because there was a period of unregulated harvest. People would harvest as many animals they could for the fur and use that for trade items. So that predominantly occurred in the 1800s. And here in New Hampshire, by the early 1900s, beaver had become a very rarely seen species. They were in the early 1900s, the last known place they occurred was in Coos County. And from a period of roughly 1905 to approximately 1920, nobody knew of beaver. It just didn't exist. And then around 1920, people were starting to see more beaver in Coos County, and they documented the population up to slightly over 200. So the period of 1920 to 1940, the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, and at that time it was predominantly law enforcement, but the wildlife biologist field, or wildlife management field, was just starting to grow within the nation. So law enforcement officers live trapped beaver and relocated them throughout southern New Hampshire with hopes of reestablishing a beaver population. And that went on for 20 years. So from roughly 1920 to 1940, beaver relocations was happening by New Hampshire Fish and Game conservation officers. And by 1940, they estimated the beaver population within New Hampshire was approximately 7,000 animals. And the legislature at that time started getting pressure on how to combat property damage by beavers because of the agriculture component of the state and roadway systems at that time. The flooding was creating concerns from numerous groups. In 1940, a conservation officer had asked to relocate more beavers, and the director at that time actually said, no more relocations. So they instituted a trapping season in an effort to help manage these beaver numbers. And during the 40s, that season went on and off. And then in 1950, it stayed open. And present day, the beaver trapping season is open. Though present day, some other things have come along as times change and management needs or management interests change. The early 2000s, there was a program called Wildlife Control Operators rules were set in place. So presently, if a person has concerns or issues with beavers, there are several avenues for them to use to manage those beavers. They could choose beaver pipes. That information has come a long ways since the 1950s. There are many designs for beaver pipes. Wildlife control operators can install beaver pipes. Landowners can install beaver pipes. It's right in there's a beaver protection law, and right in the beaver protection law, it states that beaver pipes can be erected without permit, though a little caveat to that. A beaver pipe installed definitely wants to be properly designed so that they don't act like a dam. There's a wealth of information online for people to research there. I won't get into that, and possibly may later. I'm not sure. So with that said, our current beaver population in the state of New Hampshire isn't known. To come up with those estimates, very costly. We know that they're abundant throughout the state. We use indexes to monitor our population as if it's increasing or decreasing using our trapper data, because we do have open trapping seasons. On that front, all licensed trappers, they have to have education before they can get their license. They have to pass a written test. they have to purchase a license annually, and they have to report their effort and their harvest annually so that we can monitor these populations. So with that, I will pass it on to Will. Hopefully Will's ready.
Thank you, Patrick. That was interesting. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I do have a few slides. Being a good professor and always teaching in front of people, I have a few that I can share with you. So let me see if I can get this to work here. Not many. Don't worry, not many, and actually no data. So we can talk about that if you want, but I'm not showing any of that. So Patrick talked about the beaver dams or beaver expansion. Obviously, there are dams that they make, and then because of those dams, they ended up creating ponds, right? So here's just an example of a beaver pond that we actually studied down in Massachusetts. I actually also study beaver, as well as small reservoirs, such as, for example, the Mill Pond here, which is on the other side. Can you guys see my cursor okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So here's the Mill Pond Dam, which maybe you've heard in the news, is in the news a fair amount these days and probably will continue to be for the next few months. And then this is what the river looks like without, just upstream of the reservoir. So the naturally flowing river. And so you can tell already that there's some changes that happen when you go from these different types of systems. I'm just going to show an animation, just showing you, giving you a sense of how dams have proliferated across the landscape over the last 200 years. This is human dams now, okay? So these are things that are in a database called the National Inventory of Dams, where they've gone back in time and they've been able to reconstruct when a dam was built since 1800. Obviously, a fair amount of dams were built before then, and they're not sort of included in this data set. So this is everything that's been sort of constructed since 1800. I'll just show you this real quick. Let's see if I can get it to work. Yeah, oops, sorry. Okay, no, what's going on? Okay, here. So this is just the expansion since 1800, and you can kind of get an idea of where and when these dams were built. I show this in my freshwater resources class. Okay, that makes it look like the entire continent is covered with, or a large part of the continent is actually covered by dams. Obviously, that's not the case. It's just, it should be a point, but you can kind of get a sense of how many there are across the US. And this is only large dams. So there's a certain minimum size that they included. It doesn't include the smaller ones that are maybe on individuals' property and things like that. What does that kind of remind you of? Like when you see a map that shows you how things are expanding like that, what does that kind of remind you of? Anything? Does anything spring to mind? This is a question for you guys.
For me, it looks like human population growth.
Okay, yeah, human population growth. Any other thoughts come to mind?
Like cell phone coverage.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's another thing. Very human centric, right? Any other thoughts? One more. I'll tell you what I think it looks like. What about expansion of invasive species?
Yeah.
Right? When you think of maps of starlings, they start in a certain point and then you see them expand from there throughout the country. And you can create similar maps for other, forest pests, things like that. So when you think about these human reservoirs, they are really kind of, we are an invasive species, and these are invasive ecosystems that are associated with us. Just something to kind of keep in mind when you think about these reservoirs. I have a map that shows more detail for New England. And so here you can kind of see for all of New England where current dams are. And there is a push right now for dam removals to occur as well. And so here's here's where the dam removals have occurred since, well, this is a paper that came out in 2016. So the data probably ends around 2010 or something like that. So you can see that dams are starting to be pulled, but not nearly, compared to how many there are, it's still very, very small proportion. And then I did also zoom in here into the Great Bay watershed, showing you all the current locations of dams in relation to the Great Bay here. So, given that there, and Patrick mentioned how beaver were kind of removed. So you had this landscape that had a lot of beaver distributed throughout the watersheds before colonial settlers came. And then it started to go down. And so you started to have less beaver ponds. And at the same time, you started to have more human reservoirs. But it seems likely that those are in sort of different locations. Like beaver, you kind of think of small streams probably they're more abundant in smaller streams, whereas human reservoirs tend to be located further downstream. So you had the shifting of where water is stored from up in the headwaters down to the main stem. So what are the implications for all kinds of different things? My lab is very interested in biogeochemistry, how nutrient fluxes are influenced by this. And now we seem to be heading back again to where we have more beaver in the headwaters again, and we're taking out these reservoirs downstream. So we kind of went from one extreme to the other, and now we're sort of transitioning maybe back again. So I actually have a PhD student who's very interested in this question. His name is Chris Whitney. He's actually hoping to wrap up a lot of his work over the next year or so. But the question he's asking is what happens to water quality and or nutrient fluxes to the coast, especially Great Bay, where nitrogen problems are occurring. If you go from a human dominated system where you have larger reservoirs, they have certain impacts on different nitrogen forms, versus beaver, which seem to have a different impact on nitrogen forms. And so what is going to be the net effect of that is a big question. So that's what my lab is kind of focusing on, a lot of our research. So we spend a lot of time working in reservoirs and in beaver ponds. But this is my last slide, just to kind of get you guys to think a little bit. So reservoirs, ecosystem services are something that we all depend on. When we think about what we need to survive, we need water, we need food, we need energy, other things, shelter too, but water is, tied to things like electricity. A reservoir can provide hydropower, it can provide drinking water, it can provide flood control, it could provide food if they're, fishing, recreation, wildlife habitat of a certain type, aesthetics, a certain view that you get, nitrogen retention, which is sort of a shorthand for, the biogeochemical changes. We think that reservoirs are really good at retaining nitrogen, which may benefit the coastal zone, as well as the history, just as a symbol of the history of the town. These are all some of the things that are going on here in Durham right now for the mill pond removal, and have gone on in other places too, where dam removals have occurred. But these reservoirs also come at a cost. So, obviously as dams degrade, you have to keep them up. You have to repair them, replace them, or what have you, especially if it comes to changing climate and changing flow regimes where storm events might overwhelm the capacity or the flow levels that a dam can handle. They block fish passage, especially things like river herring. Sediments deposit behind those, meaning that you have to dredge them periodically as part of the cost of keeping it up. The sediments themselves don't reach the coast then, and that's a problem for coastal marshes, which need sediments in order to keep up, sort of sustain themselves, especially in the face of sea level rise. As the seas rise, will the marshes be able to keep up when a lot of sediments are being stored behind these reservoirs? And then they also have a tendency, especially once they fill in, to degrade water quality. Water temperatures get warmer, dissolved oxygen declines, and they may also become a phosphorus source because the sediments that get deposited behind a reservoir usually carry a fair amount of phosphorus. And then if they settle, that phosphorus can become available in the water column over time, which could spark algal blooms and things like that. And just the last thing I mentioned, they're an invasive ecosystem. They tend to replace, especially these head of tide areas. These are habitats that used to be just sort of a dynamic ecosystem, which is connected to the estuary, which is now separate from it. And so these are all some of the things that you got to think about when you think about a reservoir. And, for example, the town of Durham now is going to be voting. The citizens of the town are going to be voting on whether to remove this. And really, everyone is going to come at this thinking about the suite of things that they benefit from, or the cost of it, maybe, and thinking about the benefits of a river. And so these are just a lot of the things that you need to think about when it comes to human generated reservoirs. And of course, beaver dams have their own ecosystem services and costs as well. And we can talk about this for beaver dams too. So these are just some things to think about for maybe could spark some discussion on your end as well. So that's all I got.
Great. Thank you, Will and Patrick. So I think at this point, we would love to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, you can either drop them in the chat or raise your hand and unmute, and you can ask them that way. And I'll scan through the chat and see if we can find anyone. So we have one in the chat from John Werner, and he wants to know, will UNH students will be voting in Durham on the dam?
Yeah, I think that they are allowed to vote in town elections. It is, they do vote in national elections. I don't know how commonly, I actually don't know the statistics of how often students do vote in sort of these town elections. Sometimes I think they're kind of during spring break where there aren't many around. I'm not sure about this year's town election when this referendum is being, is the vote is going to occur. So it's going to be an interesting question, and certainly it would be interesting to see how they come down on this compared to citizens.
Great. Our next question is, what are beaver pipes?
I'll answer that. So beaver pipes, also sometimes called beaver deceivers or beaver fencing. It's the use of a wooden box system that can be made. Also using plastic PVC type pipes that are perforated. And the elevation of the outlet of the pipe is higher than the elevation of the inlet. And the outlet goes where the beaver dam is. So a person would create a hole in the beaver dam, put the pipe in place, cover the top of the pipe, so that when a beaver comes along, they notice water's down, they try to repair the dam. And it's to fool a beaver into trying to repair the dam and not know where the source of the leak is in the water body. They can be very effective at keeping water levels slightly lower than what it would be without the pipe. They're generally not effective at lowering the water more than 1 foot. They have to be carefully designed considering the water depth at the dam, the amount of water behind the dam, and consider the structures below the dam because of rain events and whatnot. Those pipes can act like dams themselves and cause damage to the roadway. So it's a very complicated answer to a simple question. And as I've learned, I used to think beaver pipes were very simple structures. And the last 15 years in my job, I've learned beaver pipes are not simple structures and beavers are not simple creatures. So.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. So we also wanted to know, Andy wants to know, are there differences between the dam removals of Peverly Pond in Newington, Exeter, and Dover that were removed in recent years?
That is a great question that could probably be answered in a 1,000 different ways, I think. So I've spent some time on the Dover, I guess it's the one that's on just off 108, right, by the Sawyer Mill. That's a recent one. There's actually a really small one that was removed within Durham itself on Little Hale Road. It's near the high school, if you're familiar with it. It's a really small one, and you can see these recovering. I'm not familiar with the Exeter and the Peverly. We're also working on one that's down in Massachusetts, which is also scheduled for removal over the next year or two. So it does seem like each of them are different first of all, in their setting and how people benefited from them. So Exeter is in the middle of their downtown. Durham's is an important sort of gateway dam. Like a lot of people comment on how nice it is to have this as a view, but it's not part of the downtown, right? It's sort of separate. And the Sawyer Mill is really hardly noticed. I mean, most of the people in Dover probably don't even know about it. It's mostly the people that are in the Sawyer Mill apartment complex that really notice these things. But each of them has their own sort of how big was the reservoir relative to the size of the dam, And so I don't know if we, in terms of impacts to like water quality, that's something that we're interested in, but I haven't actually studied the ones that have been removed enough. So we've spent a fair amount of time on the Oyster, as well as this one in South Middleton, getting ready for dam removals, but they haven't happened yet. I mean, or in the thought that they would happen. So we'll have to see, I guess, to synthesize that. Maybe my student Chris Whitney, he has compared their ability to retain nutrients, and they do seem to behave fairly similarly if you account for their size. I don't know if that really is what you're after, or if that really answers the question. I guess I don't really know exactly what the differences are. Probably a long way of saying that.
Great. I still think that was a good answer. Alrighty. So the next one we have are, what are river herring?
Yeah, I guess I can, because
That's just
those
a
are
quick one.
the anadromous fish. They're very small, that migrate from the ocean up into watersheds to reproduce. And so when a dam comes in, it blocks their passage in if there's no fish ladder. And so if you go to a lot of the reservoirs around, the dams around here, they do have fish ladders, but it doesn't seem like some of them can get up, but it seems like not all of them. Like they still cause population declines. So basically river herring are, and culturally and historically, they were very, very super abundant. They supported local indigenous peoples in terms of both food, and well, I guess mainly food. And then I think also for bait fish, to catch larger fish, I think. And so their populations are declining because we have dammed up so many of the head of tide areas so that they can no longer get into watersheds where they reproduce. So they like to go up into fresh water to reproduce.
Interesting. All right. So Rich has a question for Patrick. He's wondering if Patrick can comment on the life cycle of a beaver pond, the dam and the lodge, and what causes them to be abandoned.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Most people don't think about beaver ponds having a life cycle. And I'll start with, beavers are highly territorial as a family group, and they raise their young for 2 years before they're booted. They're sent out. They got to go find their own territory. So typically beavers will go up or down the water system that they're living in to find and make a new dam, the ones that are out in 2 years. However, the adults over time and raising their young in that system will overuse their food resources depending on the size of the water impoundment. So my experience has been on an average size beaver pond being anywhere from 10 to 30 acres. Typically 7 to 10 years, you'll see beaver cycle out of that pond, which means after 7 to 10 years, you'll have a vacancy period where you'll look at the pond and you'll notice that the beaver lodge is not fresh, it's not being used, the dam's not being kept up. And when that happens, that beaver lodge will sink into the water because a beaver lodge is made out of sticks and mud. And sticks and mud together with bacteria, wood decays, the wood breaks down into soil, and the lodge simply, I'll call it the word melts into the water system, just settles down to the bottom. And the beaver dam will start to deteriorate in the same fashion. So after a period of vacancy, which in my experience has been about equal to what beaver presence is, anywhere 7 to 10, 5 to 10 years, beavers they may or not be related from that original colony, but at some point they'll find that system, come back, repair the dam, plug the leaks, and get the water level back up, and then start constructing their own beaver lodge. Another interesting thing about beaver lodges is if beavers don't leave a system, after a number of years, they'll abandon the lodge and create a new lodge. It could be 50 feet away, it could be a few 100 feet away. And from everything I've read, that's because of not bacteria, but the acidity within the system and the breakdown of the lodge itself. It's easier to rebuild than it is trying to repair, and they'll build a new one. So that's been my experience with the life cycle of the average beaver impoundment. Now, I have seen impoundments that are hundreds of acres in size never lose beaver, but I've also noticed those beavers' diets are very different than the smaller impoundments. They tend to have less use of forested foods and more use of submerged aquatics and things like lily pad root and stuff like that. So a very large beaver system has a slightly different, in my experience, a slightly different diet, and they don't evacuate from those systems altogether. Numbers of beaver will fluctuate, but they'll always have beaver present.
Cool. That's very interesting. We don't have any more questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask themselves?
Actually, can I ask one?
Yeah, feel
Patrick,
free.
because I'm very interested in the dynamics of beaver, but the young, do they go and look for their own ponds or create their own ponds separate from the family? And if so, at some point, doesn't the whole watershed saturate? And then how do they deal with that abandonment and recolonize, allowing things to regrow? It seems like it would, I don't know, the whole population would collapse because they don't have the right food, or how does that work over the longer term? Or is that something that we don't know yet?
So there's stuff that we don't know completely on what they use to make their decisions. As the adults, I use the word boot their young out after 2 years. On the larger systems, sometimes one or two, usually 1 2-year-old will some reason be allowed to stay within the colony for the next 2 years. The reasoning for that, I don't know. I know that people who harvest beavers during the trapping season have acknowledged, yeah, we caught a 2-year-old in that system, and explain how they sometimes get those 2-year-olds. And you can tell because of the body size differences. Now, having researched a lot on relocating beavers, for the aspect of, if you relocate a beaver, will it stay where you put it? Meaning like human interpretation of habitat versus a beaver's interpretation of good habitat. And the research shows that relocated beavers move greater distances from the drop site than beavers that migrate from their family group. So that question where you're saying up and down the stream, how far do beavers go? They go as far as they need to find what they consider good habitat and suitable habitat, and will make their own dam. The issue becomes if the adults go up and down that waterway, which they do, they cross up and down beaver dams. To a certain point, they consider to the adults their home range, and they mark those with what's called castor mounds. And somewhere along that line, the animals have a mutually agreed upon line that is, this is yours, this is mine. And those young have to stay out of, this is in the parents' situation, what is the parents' territory, because they're actually very aggressive animals. And they have the large incisors we all know about cutting down trees, and they bite each other heavily to harass one another out of the area. And if that beaver that's supposed to leave doesn't leave and continues to fight, it'll be a fight to the death. That's just how they are.
Fascinating.
So yeah, you would never think this cute, cuddly animal you see floating around the water can be so harsh to each other. So I don't have a good answer of how far they'll go, but they'll go down far enough until they find habitat they consider suitable. And they'll continue to move up and down that watershed to whatever they find for suitable habitat by their determination. Because I've seen a number of wetlands in this state where I look and that's beautiful beaver habitat. I'm surprised there's no beavers in there. And it'd be vacant for 3 or 4 years before they move back in the system. And there's beavers in the stream system, and why they choose not to use the habitat, I don't have an answer for. But I guess I'd say they're finicky.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's pretty cool. Awesome. So we had some new questions pop into our chat. The first one is, how effective are fish ladders?
Well, I think every fish ladder is also different as well. I don't know if you've noticed that, like if you go to the Newmarket one versus the Oyster River one, or Wiswall. Oh wait, Wiswall. Yeah, Wiswall has a new one, right? They just put one in there not too long ago. It's about 10 years now. But they do help. And so a lot of people, and actually it does help for counting. So because the fish have to concentrate, and they kind of go up the fish ladder, and you can sort of put, a volunteer can go and look down and see. And if you spend a certain amount of time there, you can actually count the number of fish that move by. But they don't get all of them. And sometimes, like, I think Game and Fish does this, where they might actually catch them and bring them up. But I think a bigger problem might actually be once the fish are ready to move back to the ocean, they don't work very well, because if the flows I think they'd like to come back later in the summer when the flows are not as high. And so the fish ladders aren't open then. And so they have to wait until, I guess, the flows are high enough. And then they have to go, I think then they mostly go over the dam somehow. And I think that might be a bigger problem, returning to the ocean rather than going up into the watershed. It's not actually my area of expertise, so that's why I'm kind of just from what I have learned over the years.
For sure, that makes sense too with the water levels.
Just say a little bit on that. He's right about New Hampshire Fish and Game. Our Marine Division does operate fish ladders. They do net fish below some of the ladders and carry them over and let them go. In the fall, they also manipulate dams for water release to help fish out. But that's my experience being around our marine biologists. I'll say that the New Hampshire Fish and Game marine biologists can answer questions much better than I can.
Well, let's see.
Got it. All right, and then I think from the last break in between the answers we had, it looked like Joey had a question. Oh, Joey you popped it into the chat. Okay.
I just put it in the chat room. Can muskrat and beaver live in the same area, or do they fight with each other?
So, they do live in the same area, and fascinating, muskrats sometimes will use the beaver lodges and co-inhabit the beaver lodge with beaver in there. It happens on occasion. So they live harmoniously next to each other. I've never have read any research about them causing negative impacts to each other. Their habitat use is slightly different in that muskrats are more of a, I'm going to use the word soft vegetation eater, whereas beavers will go in between the woody material we all know them taking down to submerged aquatics. So muskrats do not need beaver to survive. I will say that up front. Now they will co-inhabit beaver lodges sometimes. That's more of a muskrat taking advantage of a large platform that's dry during the winter months and warm versus going to what they create, because they call them push-ups. Muskrats will take cattails and grasses and create mounds themselves that look like, in the layman's terms, a miniature beaver lodge made out of cattails, and they'll get into those structures as well for warmth. But as I said, muskrats do not need beaver to survive.
Cool. To kind of expand on winterizing, we had a question: are beavers active in the winter?
They are. Beavers are active year-round. The reason we often think they're not active is they stay under the ice predominantly during the winter. They have their beaver lodge. They have a food cache outside the lodge if they're using trees and whatnot for their food source. So traditionally in the fall, we'll see a number of beaver ponds where you start seeing in front of the lodge what looks like a floating mat of tree limbs. And it's beavers cutting down various saplings and sometimes pole-sized timber, blocking into sections, bringing in the water, and then stacking on top of each other just outside their lodge. And during the winter months, they'll go under the ice because their entrances to their lodges never freeze. So they're able to get in and out of that lodge under the ice, go to that food cache, cut a piece of tree off and bring it back into their lodge. And what they're consuming is the cambium layer underneath the bark. That's their energy source. And for the systems where I mentioned where they won't make those food caches, where they'll live off the submergence, they'll go out into the water system and cut off lily pad roots and bring those back to the lodge and consume those. A beaver can go easily a quarter mile underneath the ice. The interesting thing is towards the end of winter, from my experience, they seem to get fed up with ice. And come March, you'll start seeing them go up to the outlets of the pond or the inlets to come and get on top of the ice and search for, I call it unsoured food, greener food, because Will could answer this better about beaver ponds, but my experience is they can become acidic during the winter months, and everything I've read about beaver food, they say it sours, and beavers want something that's more palatable, and they'll go out at late winter, they'll go outside of the system, the frozen system, to get that food source. So they're active all winter long. One good way to find out if you have an active beaver lodge, look at the top on a cold day. 2 or 3 days after a snowstorm, you'll see that the top center of the beaver hut, the snow is melted away. And you'll often see on a cold morning rime ice on top of that, those sticks, because the very center of a beaver lodge doesn't have mud and whatnot. It's actually it acts as similar to a chimney, so that the gases and whatnot can vent out of the system. And you get that body heat that vents out, and you get, so with that, the moisture, and then the moisture freezes on those branches. So they don't hibernate, they're active at all times.
Wow, that's awesome. Is it just their body heat that keeps the lodge warm?
It's the body heat, and depending on, as there's bacteria and whatnot, I doubt the bacteria and decay is a significant source of heat. And I suspect it's more their body heat than anything there that's keeping them warm.
That's awesome.
Can I
Alright.
comment on the under the ice in the beaver pond?
Please
So
do.
long time ago, I worked for another professor when I was an undergrad to sample methane under ice in a beaver pond. And you can Google this or look for this on YouTube, and maybe some of you already have, but sometimes you see bubbles under the ice when you go out, and those bubbles might actually be methane that's produced, which is a bacterial process. It's an anaerobic, it's like fermentation. It's an anaerobic process, and methane is the waste. You can, I've seen these videos on YouTube where people will chop a hole in the ice with a lighter nearby, and you get a flame coming out as that gas is released. Google like methane bubbles, ice, beaver ponds, or something like that, and you'll find videos of this. It's fascinating.
That's awesome.
That affects the acidity. I mean, I think what Patrick is saying about being more acidic is that decomposition continues, which produces CO2, which causes the water to become more acid.
If I could add one thing about active beaver lodges, where people, if you go out on beaver systems, always be careful around a beaver lodge. Their activity rate under the ice, because there are many propellers going under there and churning up the water. Where their runs are, the ice is always thinner than the other parts of the system. So a number of people over the years have walked next to beaver lodges. What was safe for the last half mile of ice they walked on, to step on the step and go right through in a beaver run, because the ice can go from 4 inches to a 1/4 inch thick. With new snow, you don't see it. So I just want to point that out for people's safety that are listening. If they go investigate any beaver lodges, be very careful about ice thickness.
Good advice. Great. Awesome. So we have another question from Edward. He would like to know, are there any differences in beaver life here and those in the high Rockies?
So I can't comment on differences of subspecies or anything like that. I haven't read enough about subspecies, but I can say for sure the coloring patterns are different between beaver in the New England area versus beaver out in the Rockies. The food sources they use are different simply because the food sources are different. One of the favorite foods of beaver in a forested system is balsam poplar, which in New Hampshire we have that, but we don't have it at, in my opinion, the same rate as areas out west do. So those are the differences there. And then the use of willow. I read a lot in the out west about use of willow. We don't have as much willow in New Hampshire for that to be a system. So coloring differences and the food differences, but I think that may be in part differences in the what's available, and then what's available and how that affects coloring.
Great. That makes sense to me. Cool. Let's see. So Rich would like to know if the sound of running water and what reactions beavers have to that sound.
Yeah. I have read, and we'll probably have some on this as well. I have read that beaver will block or try to block the sound of running water. So I have been told that people have done research where they put a tape recorder with the sound of running water and beaver tied to block it. But I've seen beaver pond systems that have zero running water and never had any running water. And beavers created a dam and turned a spring into a beaver pond. So there was never any running water there. Somehow in that situation, beaver knew to excavate, create a dam, and they dig their own little pond. And I've seen other systems that have very little to no flow. Beaver keep the dam completely tight. So I've seen beaver pipes where people have lowered water level with no sound, and beaver continually try to repair the dam. And my point with all this is I'm sure sound has something to do with it, but it seems that they can sense flow and they can sense water level drop as well. That's been my experience. And will provide any comment here.
I really don't know the answer to that question. I can't even address it, but that does bring to my mind the fact that beaver are able to engineer these structures to withstand a pretty long time, right? And so somehow this simple creature is able to use some, I mean, it must be able to use some simple rules for guiding the construction of this structure that is pretty robust, and I mean, it's fascinating to think about, and I don't know the answer to this either, but I've often wondered, like, what are those rules that they're using to guide where they put that next piece of wood, or even how to begin? Where do you put the first pieces? Then how do you build it up? And I don't know. It's just fascinating to me.
Me too. It's really cool. All right, so Nancy asked the question, how common is it for beavers to attack humans?
I'm happy to say I know of 0 attacks in the state of New Hampshire. There's been a few attacks in eastern US over the years. The ones I'm aware of has been situations where beavers had contracted rabies. All mammals can contract rabies, so beavers are susceptible to that. Normally, they don't contract rabies because they don't normally interact with the higher susceptibility species. So I can say I've heard of, in my 15 years, 2 or 3 that have occurred in the eastern United States, so roughly Florida upwards to New Hampshire. Given the number of people in the landscape and the number of beavers, I would say that is extremely rare. One thing about it, when these events happen, because they are so rare, they always make the headlines in the newspapers, because it's, you know, for one, it's devastating when you get bit by an animal that has roughly 1 inch wide incisors that are approximately an inch or so long, that are, you wouldn't believe it, they're razor sharp, the way they cut down on each other. They can cut paper if they want to with those teeth. That's how sharp they are. So effortlessly they can cut flesh or whatever they bite, and it makes a big gash and a lot of blood, and a devastating experience for the person. But again, it's extremely rare.
Wow. Yeah, definitely would not want to be bitten by a beaver. Great. Cool. Let's see. We have one more, it seems like. Rick would like to know, are there conditions where a dam is good for the environment and local critters?
So yeah, I think there is. And you know, basically it's a different ecosystem, right? So if you have when you put in a dam, you can have a pretty deep pond, right? You can have fish that like that kind of a habitat, and they will do very well in that case, like bass or something like that. Even if the reservoir starts to fill in, it starts to turn into a wetland rather than a pond or a lake. And then there are other species that like that habitat, like a heron, you can imagine, you know, like shallow water for some fishing of small fish. So they're definitely, you know, there are organisms that are adapted to different types of ecosystems. And so there's, you know, any place you look, generally you can find some organisms that are happy there, you know. And in terms of like good for the environment, I think the answer to that is that yes, sometimes that's also the case if they are able to retain a lot of nitrogen, for example. And this is one of the things that my lab is very interested in. Certain reservoirs of certain sizes are really good at removing nitrogen. And by that, I mean, not to get too deep into the biogeochemistry, but there's a process that basically uses nitrate. The bacteria use nitrate to breathe. Instead of using oxygen, they use nitrate. So nitrate chemical formulas, there's 3 oxygen and 1 nitrogen in a nitrate molecule. So basically it's similar in some ways to oxygen, which is just O2. So some bacteria can use that nitrate. And if that process is strong enough, then it'll return it back to the atmosphere as a harmless gas. So most of our atmosphere is actually made of nitrogen. 70% of our atmosphere is N2, which is an inert gas. And so some reservoirs are good at that. But so the question then is, which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones? And that all gets into that sort of equation about whether to remove a dam or not, which is one of the reasons why we went about studying the dams that we're studying around here, actually.
Very cool. Great. I think we maybe have time for one more question if anybody has a last burning question. I'll scroll through. I don't see any hands.
So can I ask a question of
Yeah.
everybody? It will require a vote.
All right.
So would you, I mean, this is kind of a generic question, but you can imagine yourself in a town that has a dam, right? And it's being debated whether to remove it. Would you be in favor of removing the dam just based on your experience with reservoirs, whether it's locally or, you know, in neighboring towns or somewhere else? Would you be in favor of removing it or not? And so I guess I don't know if you guys ever use the reactions, but if you like raise your hand, would you be in favor of removing? This is not an anonymous vote though. So if you're uncomfortable, you can abstain. All right, I see 4 or 5 that, okay. Few of you, yeah, okay. And so how many of you would be in favor of keeping the dam? Just based on, oh, so now you have to take everything down and wait, and then this is gets complicated on Zoom, but that's why we have elections. looks like it's about even. So, which is interesting, very, very interesting. Just, this is why like the referendum that's going to happen in Durham, I think is actually a good thing because this is true democracy. Then everyone can weigh how they benefit from the current condition versus a future, non-damned condition. So thanks for humoring me.
For sure. Maybe that will be how the vote is going to go in Durham too. We'll see. All right. We had one more quick question pop into the chat, and then I think we will end it with that question. So the last question is, can beaver dams help with avoiding floods?
So I'm hoping will answer better than I can on this, because I've been asked that from landowners, and I've also had abutting landowners concerned about beaver dams bursting and causing floods downstream.
Mhm.
I have seen beaver dams fail during extremely high rain events. I can say that the failure of the beaver dam wasn't known until the 2 days later after the storm was gone and the water receded, and people said, oh, look at that, the water's down a foot, the beaver dam broke. So on the large scale process of it, I think Will probably be able to answer that better than I can because of his watershed studies versus what I've had. So Will, if you could.
Yeah. I think there is more water storage. Obviously a pond stores more water. And if you have like a dry period where, there's always going to be some loss of water from a beaver pond through the dam, it'll trickle through and slowly it might go down. And then you have a rain event, that water can get stored in that pond instead of flowing right downstream. The worst case is like an urban stream where, you have a channel that drains impervious surfaces and everything gets in and starts rushing downstream. So having a beaver pond somewhere in there helps to store some of that. But I have also heard what Patrick mentioned, which is that when they fail, basically you can have like an extreme flood. I mean, that's a lot of water that's suddenly being released, that probably even more than you would get in a rainstorm. So you could have some catastrophic flooding. I mean, obviously it depends on the scale of the pond relative to its location in the watershed and things like that. So it gets kind of complicated. So the other part of it is that, it does also, they also store water in the summer, probably allowing a little bit more flow in the summer when it's dry than there might be otherwise as well. So it's a very complicated hydrologic response, which is why we're spending some time trying to figure some of these things out.
Cool. Great. Thank you. That was an awesome answer. Awesome. So I think we're going to close it down. It's just about 6 o'clock. So I wanted to thank all of you for coming and listening to our talk. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I know I did. I would also like to thank Will and Patrick for speaking on beavers and dams and all the fun stuff that we just heard about. While I have you, I'd also like to plug our next Science Cafe. So we will be at Portsmouth Brewery on January 16th from 6 to 7 p.m. Our topic for our next one is women on the water. So we will have 3 women from the aquaculture and the water industry coming to talk about their experiences in the industry and basically being on the water and conservation. So that should be a good one. And I would also like to thank Portsmouth Brewery tonight for sponsoring us by giving you all a discount. I hope you all went and got takeout with a 20% off discount. We will also have that same discount at our next Science Cafe in January. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I hope you had a great time. This video will also be posted on YouTube and our website. So if you would like to watch it back or you joined late, it will be available to you.